committee will come to order. This morning, the Finance Committee welcomes Treasury Secretary Yellen for a hearing on the budget. This is an important opportunity to discuss big economic challenges. So that's where I'll begin. I'm coming off a string of town hall meetings across my home state of Oregon, and colleagues everywhere I went, the number one topic of discussion was inflation. People are feeling it at the grocery store and at the gas pump. In Oregon, a gallon of gas is going for $5.42. People are paying more in rent, in shops, and at restaurants. Now, this is taking place at the same time Americans learned on Friday that unemployment is 3.6%, near 50-year lows, and wages have been rising steadily. Overall, the job market is the strongest it's been in multiple generations. But in terms of what our families are feeling on the ground, inflation is causing real headaches. The challenge is how to tackle it. There's no cure-all, but the focus in Congress has to be on finding real solutions to drive down costs, protect everybody's ability to get ahead, and strengthen our economy for the long run. A first example, Democrats on this committee are leading the effort to bring down the cost of prescription medicine. Americans are getting mugged with every visit to the pharmacy window, and it is long past time to get them relief. Moreover, it's also past time to cut the costs pushed off onto American consumers by these middlemen in our economy and in the prescription area. They're known as pharmaceutical benefit managers. A second example is energy and climate. Americans are spending huge amounts of money on gas and electricity. Putin's genocidal war in Ukraine is driving prices even higher. Oil and gas companies are raking in huge profits and handing out big checks to executives and announcing stock buybacks that benefit wealthy shareholders. All the while, the climate crisis grows around us. Bigger and hotter wildfires, stronger and wetter hurricanes, and longer and more punishing droughts. So it's a 1-2 punch. Americans pay more for gas, and they're paying more for the consequences of these unnatural disasters. I bet a lot of Americans would be interested in a plan that would lower their energy costs, make Putin poorer, and prevent climate catastrophes all at the same time. That's a big priority for Senate Democrats, beginning with the Clean Energy for America Act, which passed this committee. The bill, for the first time, uses a technology-neutral approach to taxes, and it would put our country on a path to cut emissions in half by 2030. One recent analysis found that our bill would save the average household $500 per year. And the legislation, for the first time in the history of the Finance Committee, stipulates that the more you reduce carbon emissions, the bigger your tax savings. There's also interest in ensuring that oil and gas companies can't game the tax code to pay next to nothing in taxes, and that's far too common today. Next, Senate Democrats want to lower the cost of renting or owning a home. That means investing in new cost-effective housing as well as cutting red tape, which, as I visited with the Secretary a little bit about before the hearing, is the approach Congress took years ago when it passed an electronic signatures law that I was one of the authors of that helped buyers and sellers who are just making common transactions. The bottom line is Congress shouldn't address our economic challenges by making working families worse off. Yet regrettably, that's what Republicans want to do. The big economic plan coming from the Republican campaign chief, Senator Rick Scott, is to phase out Medicare and Social Security in a matter of years. Now, Senator McConnell has gone to great lengths to keep the Scott plan hush-hush. When he was asked earlier this year what the Republicans' agenda would be if they took back the Senate, he said, and I quote, "That is a very good question, and I'll let you know when we take it back," unquote. Yet Senator Scott coughed up the truth, and he's standing by his plan sunsetting those bedrock American programs for seniors. You can bet that Republicans will want to hand a fresh round of tax breaks to multinational corporations as well. There's a long history of Republican monetary hawks rooting for higher unemployment, flat wages, and cuts to basic programs that help millions of families pay for child care, groceries, rent, and necessities. So I'll close with this. There are clear contrasts in the approach to solving inflation. We will have a lot to discuss this morning. I want to thank Secretary Yellen. She's got a very hectic schedule for joining us this morning. Look forward to our colleagues, and of course, we're interested in working with Senator Crapo and our colleagues on the committee. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Yellen, welcome to today's hearing. Thank you for being here. Inflation is at the top of my statement as well. Inflation is hurting American families and eroding wages. People are adjusting spending even on basic necessities just to make ends meet. They are being hammered at the gas pump and in the grocery aisles and across the economy. As wages rise to keep up with inflation, odds of an inflationary wage price spiral rise. Inflation became broad-based and accelerated last year following the Untargeted American Rescue Plan Act. That act poured $1.9 trillion of inflation fuel into an economy with growing supply chain disruptions and households with elevated disposable incomes and liquid savings. Following that, Democrats pushed for trillions more in reckless spending. The result, which many predicted, has been inflation at highs not seen in 40 years. As prospects of recession and stagflation rise, this is no time to consider raising taxes or resurrecting reckless spending proposals from the House-passed Build Back Better bill. The Congressional Budget Office's 10-year outlook is another warning sign that our national debt, currently at $30.5 trillion, excuse me just one moment, is another sign that we are on an unsustainable track, headed to new record highs. Inflation and accompanying higher interest rates mean higher net interest costs to services that service the national debt, crowding out other fiscal priorities. As the economy has been in recovery from COVID-related shutdowns, revenue has been up sharply under the tax system put into place before the pandemic. CBO expects revenue this year to rise to 20% of GDP, the highest in more than 2 decades, and then average well above the 50-year historical average. Nonetheless, Democrats appear to want to raise taxes even more in the face of rising odds of recession. One harmful policy is a minimum tax on financial statement or book income, something so fundamentally flawed that both parties abandoned a previously enacted version more than 30 years ago. This harmful policy would overwhelmingly hit American manufacturers as well as undercut investments in U.S. innovation and emerging technologies. This is not the only proposal from Democrats that would harm the competitiveness of American companies. Another prominent example is the international tax agreement that Treasury has negotiated with the OECD. Under both pillars of the agreement, Treasury has agreed to give foreign countries sweeping new rights to tax U.S. companies. In an apparent attempt to bind Congress, Treasury agreed to terms without engaging in meaningful consultation with Congress. For more than a year, my Republican colleagues and I have repeatedly requested information on the agreement and its potential effects. Treasury, however, has repeatedly declined to provide any analysis of the effect of the agreement on U.S. businesses or U.S. revenue or the U.S. economy overall. And from what we can see, that impact will be significant on U.S. companies, making them less competitive globally. We now know that Treasury's failure to share substantive detail foreshadowed underlying flaws and a lack of coherent principles in the agreement. It's increasingly clear that terms agreed to by Treasury will harm U.S. businesses and undermine tax provisions enacted by Congress to encourage certain activities. The flaw with this approach is that the agreement cannot be fully implemented without congressional action. In many cases, the terms can only be properly carried out with a multilateral treaty requiring a 2/3 vote by the Senate. By agreeing to sweeping changes of this nature without bipartisan support, Treasury has put at risk tax certainty and the prospect of a durable or long-lasting agreement. Beyond lack of information about the international tax agreement, nothing more is known about a possible leak of private taxpayer data from the IRS to the left-leaning group ProPublica than we knew 1 year ago when it was first reported. More work is also necessary to establish independent oversight and financial controls over the $350 billion funding to states and localities in the American Rescue Plan, where no meaningful oversight was established. Treasury must also be willing to consult Congress on debt management, which it has thus far only been comfortable doing with Wall Street and the Federal Reserve. The committee, which is Treasury's authorizing committee, deserves more transparency and accountability from Treasury than we have been receiving. Madam Secretary, I do appreciate your service, and I look forward to hearing your testimony on these matters today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. We'll be working together as we always try. Our first witness will be Secretary Janet Yellen, our first and only witness. Secretary Yellen is the 78th Secretary of the Treasury. She's the first person to have led the White House Council on Economic Advisors, the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury Department. Prior to leading Treasury and the Federal Reserve, Secretary Yellen was a distinguished fellow in residence at the Brookings Institution. She served as president of the American Economic Association, and she's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Council on Foreign Relations. She also, on a matter of great interest to the committee, was a founding member of the Climate Leadership Council. We're very glad to have you, Secretary Yellen. Colleagues, today we're really going to be focused on moving expeditiously. The Secretary has a hard stop at 12:45, and please proceed, Secretary Yellen.
Thank you. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to discuss the administration's budget proposals. This budget prioritizes essential investments in education, medical care, and affordable housing, alongside tax reforms that enable deficit reduction and prioritize a fairer tax system. Over the past year and a half, we've experienced a robust recovery characterized by strong economic growth, historically low unemployment, and high household saving rates. This rapid, broad-based recovery has been buttressed by the congressional response to the challenges of the pandemic, beginning with the CARES Act at the beginning of the pandemic and continuing with the Consolidated Appropriations Act in late 2020 and the American Rescue Plan legislated at the beginning of 2021. As President Biden said last week, we now are entering a period of transition from one of historic recovery to one that can be marked by stable and steady growth. Making this shift is a central piece of the President's plan to get inflation under control without sacrificing the economic gains we've made. We also managed to avert the far worse outcomes that were forecast at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. After the onset of the pandemic, CBO forecast that unemployment would exceed 9% in 2021. Now we're experiencing historically low unemployment. We're also witnessing sharp reductions in the budget deficit, with CBO recently forecasting the largest nominal reduction to the federal deficit in history. According to their projections, the deficit as a share of the economy this year will be at a lower level than CBO projected before the American Rescue Plan passed. Still, we currently face macroeconomic challenges including unacceptable levels of inflation, as well as the headwinds associated with the disruptions caused by the pandemic's effect on supply chains and the effects of supply-side disturbances to oil and food markets resulting from Russia's war in Ukraine. To dampen inflationary pressures without undermining the strength of the labor market, an appropriate budgetary stance is needed to complement monetary policy actions by the Federal Reserve. Moving forward, elements of the President's proposed legislation, including the clean energy initiatives and plans to reform the prescription drug market, can help lower the costs paid by American consumers.
Is that what you think is going on?
Treasury's been actively working with Congress on many challenges. Most important is our joint response to Russia's illegal and unprovoked war against Ukraine. Treasury is committed to doing what we can to ensure that Putin's brutal war continues to be met with fierce resistance internationally. Alongside more than 30 other partners abroad, accounting for more than half of the world's economy, the U.S. government has imposed unprecedented financial pressure measures on Russia and its leadership. Today, the Kremlin has been cut off from the global financial system. The Russian economy is experiencing severe contraction, with most analysts projecting a double-digit decline in Russian GDP in 2022, and they're experiencing sharply elevated inflation. We're grateful for the strong support of Congress in this endeavor, including its recent provision of $40 billion in security, economic, and humanitarian aid to the people of Ukraine. Our joint resolve is essential to supporting the people of Ukraine against this brutal invasion of their homeland. Over the past year and a half, we have successfully collaborated with Congress on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, a bill designed to do the hard generational work of building a more dynamic, structurally sound economy by smartly investing in the future. The law will rebuild America's roads, bridges, and rails, expand access to clean drinking water, ensure every American has access to high-speed internet, and invest in communities that too often have been left behind. However, our work isn't done. Building a fair and stable tax system that promotes broadly shared growth is important to both adequately funding investments and to reducing deficits and debt. I look forward to working with Congress to ensure that we continue to make progress in this regard. In the administration's fiscal 23 budget, we suggest smart, fiscally responsible investments, cutting deficits and keeping the economic burden of debt low. The budget's investments are more than fully paid for through tax code reforms requiring corporations and the wealthiest Americans to pay their fair share, closing loopholes and improving tax administration. Finally, it's no secret that I'm keenly focused on moving forward on the global agreement on the international tax reform, including a global minimum tax that will level the playing field and raise crucial revenues to benefit people around the world. Last fall, 137 countries, representing nearly 95% of the world's GDP, agreed on a deal that will stabilize our tax systems, provide resources to invest in security and respond to crises like COVID-19, and ensure corporations fairly share the burden of financing government. I'm hopeful that Congress will also implement this global minimum tax as part of its legislative agenda. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. And colleagues, let me just say in the beginning, we've got many members with questions, so this morning we're going to really have to stick to the 5-minute rule. Madam Secretary, let me start with cutting costs and fighting inflation. Some of my Republican colleagues have proposed increasing taxes on 75 million middle-class families by almost $1,500 this year alone, and on nearly half of small business owners. Instead of taking money out of these taxpayers' pockets, President Biden and Democrats propose to lower the cost of energy, health care and prescription medicine, child care and housing. We would also reduce cost pressures by making the wealthy and large corporations pay their fair share. In particular, the President and I believe strongly that billionaires should not be able to use current tax laws to pay little or no taxes for years on end. So my question, Madam Secretary, to start us off, is how would these policies reduce costs for middle-income families?
Thank you, Senator Wyden. The President supports measures that Congress legislating measures that would ease the burden on lower and middle-income families. This would involve, for example, continuation of the child tax credit, lowering the costs of prescription drugs, investing in affordable housing, lowering the cost of health care, and the energy investments that you referred to that could cut utility bills significantly. And he would pay for those proposals fully, and more than fully, the President believes we should have deficit reduction. And the revenue-raising proposals involve asking upper-income taxpayers and large corporations to pay their fair share. And so we believe, I agree with President Biden, that proposals like this would lower the costs and ease the price pressures that low and middle-income households are facing due to rising energy and food costs, the supply chain problems that have been associated with the pandemic, and deficit reduction would complement the work that the Federal Reserve is doing.
Let me get a couple questions in on the IRS. Secretary Yellen, IRS audit rates have fallen by more than 72% over the last decade, and by 86% for those earning more than $5 million per year. This lack of oversight, in effect, is given the high flyers a free pass to cheat. The IRS estimates that we're losing about $600 billion each year from taxes that are owed but not paid. The IRS commissioner testified that our losses could be as high as $1 trillion a year. The President is requesting $80 billion for the IRS over 10 years. According to the Congressional Budget Office, this investment would raise over $200 billion in revenue, primarily from high-income tax cheats. Can you talk a bit about why this is a smart investment and how it would help fight inflation?
Well, tackling that $600 billion annual tax gap is absolutely important in ensuring fiscal responsibility. It would generate substantial revenue in a manner that's efficient and fair. It would enable deficit reduction and help ease price pressures by providing the funding, a part of the funding we need for the urgent fiscal priorities we discussed. More broadly, the IRS is an agency that entered the pandemic without the funding that was in any way needed to navigate the challenges that they faced. It's remarkable that they were able to perform as well as they did in getting out child tax payments and the economic impact payments, but we absolutely have to invest in the IRS to close that tax gap, which reflects opaque sources of income, mainly by high-income earners that are not taxed. Wage payers who earn W-2 income really pay their fair share, and they need the resources to serve taxpayers, to be able to answer their phones, to be able to ensure that they receive the payments that that they're due, and they need to modernize their technology, which is really the oldest, dating back to the 60s in the federal government.
My time has expired, Madam Secretary. If my colleagues haven't asked it, I'll ask it for the record, but particularly this backlog situation, Oregonians who filed paper returns this year are wondering if the IRS has lost them. Some are desperately in need of that tax refund to pay bills. I'll talk to you about it further. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Yellen, you've heard from both Senator Wyden and me today about the significant pain Americans are suffering because of inflation that has accelerated and become broad-based following the enactment of the American Rescue Plan last year. Democrats are claiming that Republicans are trying to raise taxes. Nothing could be further from the truth, when the reality is that as we speak, the Democrats are trying to negotiate a new massive plan that would raise taxes significantly. Do you believe that it would be prudent fiscal policy to increase taxes or engage in more stimulus spending with an economy facing the prospects of stagflation?
Senator Crapo, thank you for that question. As I indicated in my response to Senator Wyden, I believe there's a lot that Congress can do to ease the cost burdens that households are experiencing. With respect to energy, the administration has done everything that they can to bring down energy costs, for example, through an historic release of 1 million barrels a day from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and energy prices, gas prices, while very high, have risen a lot. They would be higher without that. But Putin's war in Ukraine is having impacts on energy and food prices globally. We're not the only country that's experiencing inflation. You can see that in virtually every developed country around the world. What Congress can do and what the Biden administration would like to see is investments in programs like lowering prescription drug costs, investing in clean energy and renewables that would free our dependence on global oil markets, which are subject to geopolitical risk, and could bring down utility bills, affordable housing, help for child care expenses that would enable higher labor force participation, medical costs. And these are ways that the Congress and the administration can address, bring down some of the costs that households face. And it's appropriate to pay for it, or more than pay for it, to have deficit reduction. We're supportive of deficit reduction and think that asking high-income taxpayers and corporations to pay their fair share is the right way to finance those investments.
No,
and
what I
fair.
heard you say is that it is okay to raise taxes right now and that it is proper to have more stimulus spending to deal with this crisis. I just have to say I disagree with you on that. What I also didn't hear you say was that we should increase our production, our domestic energy production, rather than depressing our domestic energy production. Do you continue to believe that the President's policies with regard to reducing our capacities to develop our own oil and gas reserves and potential is the appropriate approach to this? You mentioned taking from our strategic petroleum reserves, which I think weakens us, but you didn't mention increasing our domestic production of energy.
Well, oil production in the United States fell during the pandemic. I think that oil producers didn't anticipate the strength of the recovery and the fact that oil prices would recover. And they certainly do have incentives now to increase oil production. They're sitting on thousands of leases on federal lands that they have not yet drilled, and
But the
certainly
permits
can do
for
so.
proceeding on those leases are not being facilitated. I mean, the president's executive orders have shut down the Extel pipeline. They have stopped the issuance of more leases. They've stopped the progress on the permitting of those leases, stopped the offshore oil production. The fact is we were energy independent, and now we are not, and it's not the result of the failure of our capacity.
You know, we may be energy independent, and we're actually exporting oil, but we're part of global oil markets, which are subject to geopolitical influences. And given the global nature of these markets, it's virtually impossible for us to insulate ourselves from shocks like the ones that are occurring in Russia that move global oil prices. And look, over the medium term, the critical thing is that we become more dependent on the wind and the sun that are not subject to geopolitical influences, and passing clean energy credits that will boost non-renewables is, I think, really critical to addressing climate change and our energy costs for households
Well,
going
Madam Secretary,
forward.
my time has expired, but I wanted to get into the OECD information, and maybe either in this hearing or following, we will be able to have the opportunity to discuss the fact that there are serious concerns about the impact on our economy of those changes that are being negotiated by Treasury.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Senator Stabenow.
Well, good morning, Madam Secretary. We're so glad to have you with us. I do have to say, just on the issue of gas prices, after waiting for a long time to have enough chips in this country to finally get my electric vehicle, I got it and drove it from Michigan to here this last weekend and went by every single gas station, and it didn't matter how high it was. And so I'm looking forward to the opportunity for us to move to vehicles that aren't going to be dependent on the whims of the oil companies and the international markets. Madam Secretary, let me just back up a second, because when President Biden came in, he really inherited a mess. And the reality is that even starting with the deficit, that 30% of all the publicly held debt in the country was created during 4 years of President Trump, including the largest tax cut for rich people and corporations. And so huge, and thank you for bringing that down. That deficit is now coming down faster even than we would have hoped. But there was no system for distributing vaccines. Children weren't in school. We didn't have testing, let alone home testing. We didn't have medicines. I mean, small businesses and restaurants and theaters, everyone worried about, were we going to be able to save lives and get through this? The good news is we did. And a big piece of that was what was done in the American Rescue Plan to make sure we have vaccines and could help children get back in school and help our restaurants and help people survive and so on. So I want to just reiterate the fact that based on all of that effort, we've seen the U.S. add 8.7 million jobs since President Biden took office, including 545,000 manufacturing jobs, which I'm particularly excited about. Business investment up 20%, more small business applications in 2021 than in any previous year. So that's good news. Here's the challenge that we know, and which we're all talking about now. Despite all this great news, when you have a global supply chain, and we're not getting enough of those chips for automobiles, and we have consolidation in the food industry, and we have all these other issues. People have more savings, they want to buy things, but the things aren't there to buy. And that's supply chain breakdowns, and that leads to inflation, which is where we are right now, which is what we're all talking about, which is very real for everyone. I mean, the exact story is different in different parts of the economy, but the bottom line is that people have more savings to buy things, not enough things to buy, prices go up, and so here we are. You didn't create that, President Biden didn't, we didn't. It was the result of what has happened in this global economy, frankly, that I think we need to rectify by bringing jobs home, making more things in America, and so on, which I appreciate the Biden administration doing. So if you could just take a moment to speak a little bit more about what you believe we need to be doing in Congress to help bring those prices down. It's great political theater to point and just say, oh, prices are up. And my reaction is, duh, they're up for everybody. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's going to take bipartisan support to get that done. So could you talk a little bit more about what we should be doing to help bring those prices down?
So let me say, I think that bringing inflation down should be our #1 priority, and President Biden, in an op-ed on inflation in recent remarks, has indicated that it is our top priority. We do have to recognize the Federal Reserve is charged, has an important role to play, and they're committed to doing what it takes to bring inflation down. And President Biden is strongly supportive of the independence of the Fed and getting out of the way and giving them the room to do what they need to do. I think we can complement that by deficit reduction. But beyond that, the president has done what we can to address supply chain challenges. And as discussed with Senator Wyden, Chair Wyden, that I believe Congress, the president believes Congress can do a lot to mitigate some of the most important and burdensome costs that households face, whether it's that they can't find affordable housing, that prescription drug prices are too high, and we can address that while also raising revenue for the government, whether it's high health care costs or high energy costs, by making the investments in renewables that are necessary to bring down utility bills and shield us from geopolitical developments that provide shocks to our economy. These are things that Congress can do, and in the course of doing that, we'll expand the supply side of our economy because while we know private investment is one important investment we need to make to improve the economy's potential, there are others. Infrastructure, investment in people, in education, in training, investment in child care and early childhood education, elder care that would enable greater labor force participation. All of that could help to bring down inflation and lead to strong, sustainable, stable growth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. Our next three will be Senator Grassley, Senator Cantwell, and Senator Portman. I believe Senator Grassley is coming back. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you for your statement, particularly about inflation and trying to tackle those issues. I certainly believe that if we work together in a bipartisan fashion now, there are things that we can do on all those sectors that you mentioned. I think the information age is giving us data and information, for example, on PBMs or on transparency in oil markets and various things. But one I wanted to ask you specifically about is this issue of a chip semiconductor shortage. The fact that we basically now see a 40% increase in the price of used cars. Our colleague here just said she's buying and getting access to a new electric vehicle, but so many more Americans, the price of everything has gone up. We have our trucking industry saying that they can't even ship built trucks because they don't have the chips to put into the trucks. So every aspect of our economy is now more expensive just because shipping costs are going up. And so we are trying to send a price signal in a competition innovation bill to get America's investments in semiconductors up to a level that will show people that we are going to have a domestic supply and that we are going to be on the cutting edge of the next generation of chips, while also dealing with the legacy shortage that exists in automobiles. The problem is our colleagues here don't understand the international competition and how fast they're moving to make the same investments. How critical is it that do you think that we get this done in this work period, you know, to show otherwise are we losing a much bigger race than just
and to make the investments in in semiconductors that will keep the United States in the lead in this critically important industry, and to make sure we have the capacity to produce advanced chips at home. I think this is a national security issue as well as an economic issue, and I think USICA is a very important bill that I would very much like to see passed. We found ourselves in an almost unimaginable situation where the pandemic resulted in such an explosion of demand for chips globally as people switched increasingly to digital work and communications, that our auto factories found themselves unable to get the chips. And so here you have something that's caused a significant piece of the inflation we face that really results from structural shifts induced by the pandemic and insufficient capacity at home to build semiconductors. So I think this is a critically important investment.
So you're just to be clear on that point, you're saying the chip shortage has added to our inflation woes? And
Absolutely. Look, I believe about a third of U.S. inflation is new and used cars, and manufacturers have been forced to actually cut production of cars when they face absolutely record demand for those vehicles, and it is all due to a shortage of semiconductors.
well, and since this market is so strong, it gets a little confusing to people, but at $20 billion a pop to build a foundry, most companies don't have $20 billion sitting around. And so the international chase to get that industry in those countries, I don't know if you think this is a seminal moment for us in this level of investment. I just see what's transpired with us going down in production over the last decade. And I now see how hungry Europe is and how hungry Asia is. How competitive is the financing environment in other countries?
Well, there have been subsidies in many countries of semiconductor production, and certainly a conscious drive in China and other places to boost semiconductor production, and it's drifted away from the United States. And I think we need to do that. It's really critical that we develop that capacity, and certainly American companies understand this and are looking to do it. But USICA would make a big difference to their ability to get that financing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Next would be Senator Portman. After him, Senator Menendez. After him, Senator Toomey. After him, Senator Carper, Lankford, Cardin, Daines, Brown, Young, Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you so much for always being so candid and presenting today before the committee. Let me start with affordable housing, because we are lacking affordable housing in the state of Nevada and quite honestly across the country. I do know that the state and local fiscal relief funds that were provided in the American Rescue Plan provided states with the ability to make a historic investment in desperately needed affordable housing in communities across our country. In Nevada, we expect to build or preserve at least 3,000 new affordable homes with these funds. It's very important that the American Rescue Plan funds leverage the nation's most reliable and impactful affordable housing production investment, which is the low-income housing tax credit. Here's my concern. I am concerned that in my state and some of the states across the country, they're not able to use the funds that they were received through the state and local fiscal relief funds to leverage those against the low-income tax housing credit. So my hope is that the administration, and particularly Treasury Department, will help us clarify to those states that those funds can be used for that leverage. And I'm curious your thoughts on that process.
Well, we are absolutely encouraging the state and local relief funds to be used for affordable housing. And actually, recently we published a fact sheet that explains practices that we have found promising and highlighting some of the ways in which these funds are being used for this purpose, but certainly we are strongly encouraging that these funds be used to boost the affordable housing. I mean, on the low-income housing tax credit, I know there's been an issue around average income regulations, and that was something that Congress intended to provide flexibility to entities that use that credit. And it is our highest priority for our tax team to make sure that those regulations capture that flexibility.
Thank you. I am hearing just in my state that by aligning the low-income housing tax credit with state and local fiscal relief funds, that's the difference between building 3,000 units and 8,000 units in my state. So I have introduced the Lifeline Act, and what this bill really does, it allows state and localities to loan the state and local fiscal relief funds to the low-income housing tax credit projects. The loan authority is necessary because of the obligation to spend all of the state and local fiscal relief funds by 2026. That's my first priority, to pass that. As you can see, there is a challenge in getting both sides, Republicans, Democrats, on board essential legislation to lower costs for families, unfortunately. So my next ask is that I am hopeful that the Treasury Department clarifies in its final rule and it allows those types of loans, whether they're blended loans or grants to nonprofits that provide loans, just clarifying through your rules that those funds can be used in that way. That will help us build these more affordable homes in my state and across the country.
I'd be happy to work with you on that, and I'll make sure that my staff is in touch with yours to make sure that we're
Thank you.
addressing that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me jump to Social Security Administration. I appreciated the recognition in the budget of the challenges faced by many individuals in accessing Social Security Administration services. Communities are still reeling from the public health and the economic impacts of the pandemic, and in many cases, the services and supports that the Social Security Administration provides are key to helping individuals recover. Can you talk through the investment in the Social Security Administration that you've proposed in the budget, and how will they help folks access their earned benefits when they need them?
So I know that that's the purpose of those investments. I'll need to get back to you on details.
Please do. I was just in my home state, and we are talking about the high costs that we are seeing at so many levels. And to the extent that we can work together to lower costs at all levels for families, including those that are relying on Social Security, will be beneficial, not just in Nevada, but across the country. Secretary, thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank my colleague. I'm very interested in working with her on these housing issues. That is so crucial. Senator Toomey's next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, welcome back to the committee. I'm going to talk a little bit about a subject on which you and I disagree, which won't surprise you. But I think it's important that we have a candid conversation about the tax reform of 2017 and the danger that that I associate with the administration's attempt to really throw it out. And let me just remind my colleagues, these are objective facts. In the wake of the tax reform of 2017, take 2019, the first year for which it was fully implemented, we had the best economy of my lifetime. 20% of the income in America pays about 40% of the taxes. But what about federal tax revenue? Oh, well, that surged. And this year, looks like we're going to reach another record high. It's coming in so far this year 22% higher than last year, and last year was a record. For this year, corporate tax revenue is on track to be at the highest level of GDP since 2015. So the statistics are unbelievable. Like, I don't know how you could even conjure up a better economic outcome than what we had right before the pandemic hit. Now, you could suggest that, oh, it's all a coincidence, that the tax reform resulted in exactly what some of us predicted and suggested might happen, which is an acceleration of investment, strong economic growth, repatriation of a huge amount of overseas money. But that's pretty improbable. The fact is, we had the best economy of my lifetime by far, and it was working best for low-income Americans, ethnic minorities who historically have not had as good an economic results as others. And so the Biden administration comes along and says, let's look at all this data and let's throw out the tax reform. It's unbelievable. But my understanding is that apparently is still on the table out of, in part, this concern that if we don't do this two-pillar tax reform that I know you've negotiated, Madam Secretary, we have what you characterize as a race to the bottom, which to me is competition among countries to have an attractive environment for investment. Frankly, I think we should be looking to win that race, not to prevent the race from taking place. But I understand that we've got this negotiation. What we haven't seen is how this gets implemented. So 2 quick questions, and then I'll let you respond. First, I'm very concerned about the impact that the proposal will have on American competitiveness. My understanding is that the Treasury Department has run an analysis, has data about the impact on American business if the tax reform that you have proposed would go forward. So I'd like to know when we can get access to that data. That's my first point. And the second is that since Pillar 1 of your two-pillar model requires modification of existing tax treaties, it seems clear to me that has to come to the Senate for ratification. I have not yet heard an agreement that that's in fact going to happen, and in the absence of that, an explanation for why, since the Constitution requires it, why it should not. And with that, I will yield to the Secretary.
Well, just very quickly, with respect to access to data, of course, the data relating to Pillar 2 is available, and that was included in the House-passed bill and scored by JCT. So I think you must be referring to Pillar 1 right. and the impact that that would have. And what I would say there is that it could go either way, depending on the details which have not yet been decided in the Pillar 1 negotiations. The impact on fiscal revenues will be small. Pillar 2 has a big impact. Pillar 1 will have a small impact. We're a very large market economy. We will gain revenue from our ability to tax foreign corporations that are doing business in the United States where we consume those services. We will lose some from revenue that's taxing authority that's reallocated to foreign countries. Net, it could be positive or negative depending on details that have not yet been worked out, and that's why we've not provided data. We will when those details are clearer.
And the ratification process?
And the ratification requires Congress's approval. I think there's no doubt about it, but the form that needs to take is still to be determined.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank my colleague. Just so we're clear, one of the first things we stated at the outset is we've got Senate Republicans now proposing to increase taxes on 75 million middle-class families by almost $1,500 this year alone and on nearly half of small business owners. Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, welcome. Very nice to see you. Thank you for your extraordinary service over the years. Madam Secretary, I don't know what you were doing when you were 29 years old. I was elected state treasurer of Delaware, and we had the worst credit rating in the country. We were dead last. I think we were tied with Puerto Rico, actually. We had no pension fund. We had no cash management system. We had no cash. And I got to be state treasurer. I've been a vocal advocate for a fair and well-functioning tax system ever since that day, and I still am. One way to achieve this goal is by making sure that the taxpayers don't have to jump through hoops to file their taxes. The IRS Free File program was established, as you know, for this very purpose, to help low and middle-income families file their taxes easily and without unnecessary fees. However, the program has not lived up to its potential, as you know. In recent years, Free File has faced a number of challenges. They include the withdrawal from the program of major providers, deceptive marketing from providers, and a low participation rate among eligible taxpayers. A recent GAO report, one that I actually requested, recommends that the IRS work with relevant stakeholders to develop additional options for free online filing of tax returns. My question is this: what steps should we here in the Congress and the IRS take to improve accessible and affordable tax filing options for the American people?
So let me say that I totally agree with you that filing taxes can be costly, complicated, and time-consuming for American families. And there's a study that shows it takes 17 hours on average and costs about $230 to complete a tax return. And it's very worthwhile, and we are exploring options to reduce these burdens. On top of that, I'd like to add what's also important for American families is to be able to access payments that they're entitled to, whether it's the EITC or child tax credits or economic impact payments. That's another way in which they interact with the IRS, and it's important that we make tools available that make that easy and get those payments to the families that are entitled to them. But, you know, the fundamental problem we have here is that the IRS is just horrendously under-resourced. I think it's miraculous that
Would you say that again? Say that one, that bears repeating. Just say it again.
The IRS is horrendously under-resourced. It has fewer staff than it had, I believe, 40 years ago. And our economy has grown in size. It's operating with technology from the 1960s, using a programming language that is archaic and is no longer taught in any school in the country. And it doesn't have the resources it needs. And the pandemic was a huge hit to it, left it with a huge backlog of returns and information that had to be processed that is really top priority. We then asked it to get out 3 different economic impact payments, child tax payments on a monthly basis, and it's amazing that they were able to do it. So I think this is important. We're looking at it. I agree this is something that the IRS needs to do. But if we want to ask it to do these things, given all the other burdens, we really have to, and I think it should be very high priority for Congress to give the IRS the resources it needs, not to mention closing the tax gap.
I'm Tom Carper, and I approve this message. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
One second question, short one. Secretary Yellen, how can common sense reforms to estate and gift taxes make our tax code fair and more fiscally responsible?
I believe there are loopholes there that should be closed. We put out a number of proposals relating to estate and gift taxation in the Green Book, and we're exploring ideas where we believe that we can curtail some techniques that are used that we can do under existing authority. Agree with you. That's an area to be scrutinized carefully.
I'm going to ask you to respond more fully in writing, but thank you for that initial response. And again, thank you for joining us today and for your work.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Senator Langford's next.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Secretary Yellen, thanks for being here as well on it. This morning, I actually sent over a letter to you just because it is the one-year anniversary of the ProPublica release, actually. And the challenge that we have is getting information about taxpayer information and how it is kept secure. We have asked for just a hearing, just a briefing, just to be able to sit down with you and your team and say, how is taxpayer information being protected? What has changed in this time period? We're not asking for the specific 6103 information. We're not trying to get into the specifics of what's out there with ProPublica. We know there's an investigation. But at the one-year anniversary, we just want a yes or no answer. Can we get a briefing with you and with your team on how taxpayer information is now being protected and what's changed?
I will certainly ask my team about that and have them get back to you, and we'll try to arrange something. Let me just say, it is very high priority. Look, disclosure of confidential government information is illegal. It's something we take very seriously. There are procedures and controls in place.
We're just a year into it, and we haven't got any information on what's actually happened. So we've heard that, but we just don't know what's actually happening behind the scenes. We just continue to hear and see information leaked out over and over again. So we want to get as much information as we can on it and what's being done, how things have changed.
Absolutely. I don't think that there's information that's being leaked out over and over again. If there is, I'm certainly not aware of it.
Well, thank you. We'll follow up on that. We would like that briefing time on the OECD question on this. This is a challenge for us as we're just trying to keep flow of information as well of what's actually happening on it. In this case, I'm going to show you a map real quick. In this case, we've got an American company. This American company has done everything we've asked them to do based on tax policy. Their jobs are here. Their intellectual property is here. Their research and development is all being done here. They've done all that according to our tax code that Congress has passed to incentivize that. Now, all these countries in the dark blue will have leverage over those American companies that are following our tax law to be able to determine how much they're going to now pay overseas. So if China or the UK gives a subsidy instead of actually having R&D credits on it, then suddenly these American companies following American law are now going to pay more. So our concern on this OECD agreement that's happening is it seems to be structured to incentivize companies to move their IP internationally or to move their R&D internationally. That would allow them to be able to balance out their tax portfolio. Help me understand where I'm wrong on this.
I don't understand that. I mean, we are the only country that imposes any minimum tax on the foreign earnings of our multinational corporations. It's currently at 10.5%, but on a blended rather than country-by-country basis. No other country does this, and what this global deal is going to do is to force every other country around the world that signed up, 137 countries that have signed this agreement, to impose a minimum tax on their corporations, on their overseas earnings of at least 15%.
But our understanding of this is they'll impose that 15% minimum, and then they'll actually take out things like their subsidies, where our credits that have been passed in law won't count on that, but their subsidies will.
Many of our credits will count on that.
But their subsidies won't, yeah.
Well, it's structured so that direct subsidies aren't counted, whether we give them or they give them.
Right.
But on the tax side, it does count. But we certainly would work with Congress to make sure that the benefits that Congress intended, the business credits, are structured so that they will be available.
So yeah, that is reassuring to hear, because we've not had this sense of working with Congress through this process. It seems to be a deal that's negotiated everywhere else, and it's coming back to us last. Obviously, according to the Constitution, revenue changes have to be done through Congress and have to be voted on here. There seems to be an incentive to be able to move to something very different. This is the same thing we're dealing with the foreign tax credit piece right now. The foreign tax credits, the regulation was actually put out in January. A lot of companies, including companies in my state in Oklahoma, are really struggling to be able to understand that. We've had folks from Treasury that have come out and said more guidance is needed, but it seems to be the train is still moving, and they're still trying to figure out only with an audit at some future date if they were following the rules or not on this, because the guidance has not actually come out on time. So can you help me with the foreign tax credit piece to know, is this going to be delayed, or is it still going to be implemented this year when there's not guidance, but there's been a change, and it's been a change that's been different than what's happened for decades?
Well, we have issued a regulation,
But no
we
guidance.
do understand that there are some issues that businesses have around it, and we certainly wish to work with you to address those.
Will it be delayed, the implementation, until they get guidance?
Time of the gentleman's expired. Let's get an answer to this.
I don't think it will be delayed, but we will work to address issues with it.
I thank my colleague. Senator Cassidy's next.
Madam Chair, several things. Madam Secretary, I'm sorry. Social Security is going insolvent. The administration has not proposed anything to address the insolvency. Is there going to be a plan coming forward from the administration to address Social Security insolvency, which is, I think, 12 or 13 years away now, with all the implications of further delay makes it harder to address?
Well, so we gained 1 year in terms of the life of the Social Security fund, how long it continues to fund benefits. That was in the recent
Yes, but that's,
Security
if you take a
report.
75-year scoring, we've learned that it's going to be a $211 trillion deficit over 75 years. So saying that it's going to be extended 1 to 2 years seems almost, silly. No offense.
So I do believe this is something, it's certainly true that it's not sustainable on a 75-year basis, and this is something that Congress and the administration should address. This is not news, I would say. We've known about this for at least 30 years and have not taken steps to address it.
So you agree it's important to take those steps?
I do believe it's something we should do.
Let me move on. As regards the inflation, one variable that we can potentially impact is the price of oil and gas. Now, you've mentioned how it's an international market and there's some limit as to the impact of what we do locally. But that said, the administration has proposed decreasing tax incentives for the production of oil and gas. Now, if you decrease tax incentives, you're going to have less oil and gas produced. Now, that's going to intuitively decrease supply and contribute to that upward pressure. Does that make sense?
Well, over the medium term, we absolutely need to move to renewables and to
Now, but I'm speaking about right now. If we decrease tax incentives to produce, that will decrease supply. And yet the administration is proposing to do that. Well, I'll just make that point and then move on. Indeed, if we're going to speak about, I have a quote here, apparently one of the major problems with producing oil and gas right now is the cost of oil field services. And here's a quote from the CEO of Occidental. She says that the, quote unquote, the paraphrase, given how expensive drilling and oil field services have gotten, it's almost value destruction if you try to accelerate anything now. Now, what would you think about increasing the tax incentive to drill oil and gas, recognizing what the CEO of Occidental says, that the cost of oil field services are so great, it is value destruction to attempt to accelerate?
Well, prices are very high, in part because of, importantly, because of Russia's war on Ukraine. And I believe the incentives are certainly there to boost production, and that is something we need in the short run to
So
relieve
if we could
pressures.
make a case that, and I don't mean to be rude, I'm sorry, if we could make the case that increasing the incentive, increasing the tax credit for 3 to 5 years to offset the increase cost of oil field services could increase production. Would that be something that should be entertained?
Well, look, I think it's profitable as it is. Prices have gone up a lot, and that helps to offset those costs, to help oil companies cover them. And so the price system is working and provides incentives.
Now, what we're trying to do is lower the cost. Well, let me just move on. We're in a situation right now as regards Russia and the price of oil, in which, because of the restrictions on purchasing Russian oil, their oil profits have increased. So they're selling less, but at a higher price. To say one more time, Russia now makes more money from oil and gas sales than it did before we began to apply sanctions. Now, the Europeans have considered coming together as a buying bloc to limit the price that we will pay, monopsony power, if you will. We'll pay the price of production, but no more. And so therefore, we don't pay the higher price at the pump, but they don't get the increased revenue. Is the administration participating in this? Are we taking the lead in this? Is this something that we would entertain?
Absolutely. Our objective is
So absolutely, we are involved in discussions to come up with a buyer's block that will not pay
Yes.
more than X amount?
Yes, we are.
Can you give a kind of assessment of where those negotiations are?
Extremely active.
Senator-
I think what we want to do is keep Russian oil flowing into the global market to hold down global prices and try to avoid a spike that causes a worldwide recession and drives up oil prices. But absolutely, the objective is to limit the revenue going to Russia, and the kind of strategy you suggest, there are different ways technically of accomplishing that, but it's certainly a desirable strategy
The time of the
consider.
gentleman's expired.
Thank you.
Thank my colleague. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for your service. I first want to just concur with the comments of our Chair, Senator Wyden, and Senator Carper in regards to needing predictable, sustainable funding for the Internal Revenue Service. The budget that the administration has supported does that, but we need staying power here. I've been working with Senator Portman when we were both in the House of Representatives trying to modernize the IRS through resources for the level of service, for the fairness in enforcement. And I just really want to underscore the commitment needs to be there for a sustained period of time so the IRS can provide the level of service that Americans expect and provide the fairness in our tax code. But I want to question in regards to affordable housing. Over this work period, I was on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and Cambridge, looking at some of the challenges we have there for affordable housing. That's a rural area. We go to urban centers, rural areas, we have affordable housing issues. And there are several provisions in the administration's budget that I think are important, that have bipartisan support. We could talk about the historic tax credits, which was used in regards to Cambridge. We can talk about the new market tax credits. Senator Blunt and I have introduced legislation that would extend and make permanent the new market tax credits. Low-income housing tax credits has been an issue that we've had bipartisan support. But I want to concentrate, if I might, on the Neighborhood Home Reinvestment Act that Senator Portman and I have introduced, that's in the administration's budget, that deals with the appraisal gap. There are neighborhoods in which you cannot refurbish homes because the market price makes it impossible to put that investment in. And the Neighborhood Home Reinvestment Act deals with that appraisal gap by providing a credit so that we can have a larger stock of affordable housing in communities that today are being neglected. So can you just share with the committee the priority of this administration in regards to affordable housing and specifically the Neighborhood Home Investment Act?
Well, we're certainly supportive of that, and affordable housing, I think, is one of the most serious and growing challenges we face in this country, and the administration is trying to think of everything we really can to promote the building of affordable housing, the low-income housing tax credit, the New Markets Initiative, and other things that the administration can do internally to try to promote affordable housing.
I would just underscore, as we talk about American families struggling today because of increasing pricing, housing is one of the key areas. We know we have a tremendous shortage. So I just hope that you would put a real priority on it. We have bipartisan support. We need not only for your support, but your active engagement in order to get this to the finish line, because we have strong support on this committee, and I hope that we'll see it in one of the tax bills that make it to the President's desk for signature. I want to talk about another tax issue that is moving in Congress. The House has taken action on retirement security, a pretty comprehensive bill. Our chairman and ranking member, Chairman Wyden and ranking member Crapo, are bringing all of us together in regards to retirement security. I've worked with Senator Portman for many years on these issues. And we're looking at how we can get people who have saved too little in the past adequate incentives to save, help for small businesses to create saving opportunities for their employees, provide more certainty and flexibility for Americans in the retirement years. All of those are areas that I think are not controversial. They're bipartisan. But once again, if we're going to be able to have that three-leg stool for retirement security, Social Security, private savings, and retirement, we need to strengthen our retirement security tax laws. We need your push here to get to the finish line, because there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of interest groups, and we've got to come together in a relatively short period of time in order to get a bill passed. Is the administration willing to help us get a retirement security bill to the finish line?
We certainly look forward to working with you on it, and our staffs can talk to one another about what's needed. We're certainly glad to work with you on that.
Well, I appreciate that. We're going to need some priorities here from the administration to help us. There are different views, and we have to reconcile different committees here in the House and the Senate. I know there's a lot on your plate, but I would urge you to give this a high priority. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Cardin, and Senator Crapo and I are going to give the retirement bill a very high priority. Good work. Senator Portman's next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your focus on the retirement policy front, as well as Ranking Member Crapo, and to Senator Cardin. Thank you for asking the question. I appreciate your willingness to continue to provide technical assistance to us and get through this. This is one of the great bipartisan opportunities we have that actually help the people we represent at a time when people's savings are under more and more stress, and during COVID, a lot of people took money out of their savings. This will help them save for their own retirement through private retirement, and deals with really the 4 or 5 concerns that on a bipartisan basis all of us have raised with regard to the retirement system. And so thank you for working with us on that, and thanks you to Senator Cardin for raising it. On the issue of foreign tax credits, I'm very concerned with the new regulations, in particular the lack of notice and comment that went into the final draft of that. It's a pretty simple issue to me because countries all around the world provide foreign tax credits, so there's not double taxation. So if a U.S. company pays taxes overseas, you don't want to double up and have them pay taxes here, because we want more U.S. companies to do business overseas. I'll give you an example. In my hometown of Cincinnati, Procter & Gamble has over 10,000 employees. 40% of those workers support global sales, international sales outside of the United States. So this is great for us. A lot of those are service jobs, back office jobs, high-paying jobs, by the way, white-collar jobs that help strengthen our Ohio economy. But this happens all over the country. And so my concern is that the interest in avoiding double taxation is compromised when you look at these new regulations. Post TCJA, which was 2017, we saw that if businesses are able to compete and workers are able to compete, they do pretty well. In fact, we had a lot more money come back into this country because of that, and we stopped inversions altogether, something all of us, were wringing our hands about and being very concerned about, which is companies literally becoming foreign companies to avoid the tax laws here. We stopped them, shut them down. So I think what you're doing right now with these new regulations is pulling us in the wrong direction and back to where we were not competitive. So I appreciate you've indicated you want to make changes to the cost recovery and royalty withholding portion of the rules, but I also understand that you've indicated you will not be amending the rules dealing with the creditability, the ability to take credits with regard to withholding taxes on services. And again, that's a lot of what we do in this country. So my question to you would be, one, do you agree with me that we want to have global companies here in America that are expanding jobs here and therefore taking advantage of what, again, the global community does, which is these tax credits, including for services? Or are we just on a different philosophical plane here? If so, that'd be helpful to know. And second, would you be willing to take a look at these regulations as they relate to services in particular to help protect jobs here and look at particularly further modifications for withholding taxes on services?
So let me say first, of course, we will look at any concrete suggestions that you have and work with you. We understand that there are concerns about these regulations, and we certainly will revisit them and look at comments. But philosophically, let me say, we think that these regulations are very important to protect critical interests of the United States. And the fundamental principle is that we should allow a credit for foreign taxes only where the foreign taxing jurisdiction has the primary right to tax the income. And what we're seeing around the world are new kinds of taxes, like digital service taxes, where foreign countries are essentially trying to expand their taxing jurisdiction through extraterritorial type taxes. And these are taxes that should not be entitled to take the foreign tax credit. And if we grant it, we're just encouraging countries to impose taxes that we think, in the case of digital service taxes, we've found them to be unfair trade practices.
Well, Madam Secretary, let me interrupt just for a second because I have a limited time. I don't disagree with you on the digital services taxes. That's not the issue here, and I understand your position on that, and I tend to share your position. I think American companies have been unfairly targeted with regard to digital services taxes. I'm talking about withholding taxes with regard to services. And I think it's important that we have final regulations that have received notice and comment, from American workers through American companies, because it's very different than the initial regulations in that regard. So that's the issue I'm focused on today.
Well, we certainly work with you on that, and we're reaching out and understanding what the concerns are about
One
those
idea,
rules,
has been floated as a one-year delay to give us a chance to actually get the notice and comment and understand it better. I hope you would consider that.
The time, my friend, has expired, and did you want to respond to that, Secretary Yellen?
I was just going to say that if there are changes, they can be applied on a retroactive basis.
Very good. Thank you. Senator Daines is next, and then I very much hope we can get Senator Casey, who's been so patient, and we'll have to see who else is coming. Senator Daines.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Secretary Yellen, thanks for being here today. I do want to talk about inflation because that's what everybody's talking about back home. The chairman mentioned that in his opening remarks. It's truly remarkable what's happening with the inflationary hurricane force winds that are blowing today. It's in the minds of the people that I serve every day, Montanans, every day. They're seeing it at the gas pump, they see it at the grocery store, they see fertilizer prices for our farmers. The Biden administration has attributed, though, this broad-based rapid inflation that began last year to Putin. We've been attributed to greed, to triggered exploitation, to profiteering. The one thing we've not heard the administration say is that there may have been a contributing factor with the $1.9 trillion spending package that was passed in March of 2021 by this Congress, that we were calling out the concerns of the inflationary pressures it would create in the economy. Even former Obama administration officials, we saw that with Larry Summers, who was a director of National Economic Council under Obama, was also President Clinton's Secretary Treasurer. He warned this would spark inflation. He was exactly right. In fact, in a recent Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco research paper titled, quote, "Why is U.S. inflation higher than in other countries?" analysts confirmed the strong connection between heightened U.S. inflation and the government spending that was occurring earlier last year. A large portion of that spending was in that $1.9 trillion package. By the way, there was over $1 trillion of unspent COVID dollars coming into December of 2020. We warned everybody up here, you can't spend another $1.9 trillion because it will have inflationary effects. I've not heard this administration say anything about that, but I do want to allow you the opportunity to set that record straight. My question is, Secretary, do you agree with the San Francisco Fed that the nearly $2 trillion March spending package was a significant causal factor in the high, increasingly broad-based and accelerating inflation that we observed this past year?
Senator, we're seeing high inflation in almost all developed countries around the world, and they have very different fiscal policies. So it can't be the case that the bulk of the inflation that we're experiencing reflects the impact of the ARP.
So was it a causal factor, would you say, that $2 trillion when we had $1 trillion unspent? So do the quick math here. It's about $3 trillion that was put into this economy from December through March of 2021.
So I guess the way I see it is when President Biden was inaugurated, he inherited an economy with very high unemployment, and the Congressional Budget Office and other forecasters were envisioning that this could last for a very long time. And we had to address the possibility that this could be a downturn that would match the Great Recession. And so in designing a policy, there are various risks that need to be taken into account. Of course, inflation was one of them, but the overwhelming risk was that Americans would be scarred by a deep and long recession, and that they would lose the roofs over their heads and not be able to feed their families.
Right. Well, I respectfully, I mean, if there was a forecaster who was worried about the high unemployment rates, that forecast was, I think, massively off, and we're seeing now the biggest challenge, of course, is just families cannot afford to keep food and fuel.
Well, inflation is the number. There's no question. I want
to talk about OECD for a moment here and China's compliance. We've seen China's recent history of non-compliance with international agreements. I'm concerned that China's not going to play by the rules with this agreement. Whether they'll ever play by the rules becomes a question. Here is the question: what makes you confident that China won't similarly stonewall efforts under the OECD agreement to determine whether Chinese companies are in compliance? And this gets back to the SEC issues and so forth.
So China agreed, was one of the 137 countries that agreed to comply with these rules, and we expect it to do so. But if it fails to do so, this agreement contains an enforcement mechanism that will allow the United States or any other country that has adopted the global minimum tax to impose taxes on China's companies that would be the same as if China had complied. So there is a tough enforcement mechanism in this deal, and if China doesn't comply, then the U.S. and other countries where Chinese firms do business will be allowed to collect the taxes on those Chinese firms on their business outside China that China hypothetically refuses to collect itself.
Time of the gentleman's expired. Senator Grassley. You're next. I was hoping we could get Senator Grassley and Senator Casey, but we have had a number of colleagues coming in. Let me ask my colleague from Indiana, have you voted already?
I have not, Chairman.
Okay.
I have not either.
Well, the vote hasn't started. All right. We'll go with Senator Grassley, and then we'll go back to the regular order. Thank you.
I can't remember that you've said anything about corporate greed being a cause of inflation, but several members of your political party have, and yet we have mainstream Democratic congressmen or economists reject the greed theory. Jason Furman called it a sideshow. Larry Summers said it was a diversionary. Benjamin Page said it was a red herring, and Catherine Rampel for the Washington Post referred to it as an inflation conspiracy theory. What is your opinion? Does corporate greed explain the broad-based price increases consumers are currently facing?
Well, I guess I see the bulk of inflation as reflecting demand and supply factors. And on the supply side, we've had huge supply chain issues due to the pandemic and shifts in the pattern of consumption away from services and toward goods. We've had enormous increases in food and energy prices, partly reflecting Russia's war on Ukraine.
I think
and those are, to me, the key
you're answering the question in a way that I'm glad you answered it, because I think that your answer rejects the corporate greed argument that we've been hearing. Next question. My concern with the current focus on so-called corporate greed is that it risks taking us down the failed roads of the 1970s, where we had price controls and windfall profit taxes. These policies led to rampant shortages, most notably gas lines around the block. Do you agree that neither price controls nor windfall profit tax are viable solutions to inflation and would have serious negative consequences?
Well, I do believe in a strong antitrust policy, and that's something that's been a priority of the Biden administration. Having active competition in markets, I think, is critical to innovation and to consumer well-being. And so enforcing a strong antitrust policy, I think, is important. But with respect to the broader inflationary trends, the Fed has to play a critical role. I think deficit reduction deserves a complementary role. And we've discussed earlier in this hearing ways in which Congress can bring down many of the costs, possibly not food and energy, but costs that are really burdening American households, whether it's prescription drugs, the lack of affordable housing.
I think I take your answer as, with all the reasons you've given, that you're not advocating or thinking that price controls or wind profits taxes would have anything to do with fighting inflation. I'm going to yield back my time because I got to go over and vote. I'll put questions in.
I'm going to go to my colleagues. Just so we're clear for the record, Clean Energy for America, passed in this committee, according to independent analysts, will save families $500. Okay. Let's see. Now we have an order of appearance, Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, our country is suffering from a mass shooting epidemic. This year alone, there have been more mass shootings than days in the year. 22 schools have come under gunfire already this year, including Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, where 19 children were killed in cold blood in their classroom along with 2 teachers by an assault rifle. According to the Washington Post, more than 311,000 children at 331 schools have experienced gun violence at school since the 1999 Columbine shooting. After decades of Republican obstruction to Democratic efforts to address this epidemic of school shootings, we are now learning the long-term cost of this trauma. Researchers at Northwestern University found that students who are survivors of gun violence at school are less likely to graduate high school, and they are less likely to attend and/or graduate from college. These survivors are also less likely to be employed as adults than their peers. And if they are employed, they are likely to earn less over the course of their lives. So, Secretary Yellen, what is the economic cost of allowing the trauma of unabated gun violence in our communities and schools to continue unaddressed?
Well, Senator Menendez, let me first say I am also horrified classified gun violence, what we've seen in recent weeks over many years. And I do hope that Congress will take long overdue action and put in place common sense measures to reduce gun violence. I'm not an expert at all on the psychological impact of gun violence on student learning or human capital accumulation, but and I'm not knowledgeable of the study that you mentioned, but I do know that there is a large literature in economics that documents that events that take place in early life in childhood can have a lifelong impact on life outcomes, on labor market outcomes, on psychological well-being. And so it only stands to reason that the threat of violence at schools it keeps our kids
So
from
let me just
learning.
ask you from an economic, I know you're not a psychologist, but if Northwestern University's study that found that students who are survivors of gun violence are less likely to graduate high school, less likely to graduate from college, and more likely to earn less over the course of their lives, doesn't that have an economic impact?
Of course, it has a negative impact on these individuals and on our economy. And I don't know what the aggregate size of that is, but it certainly has a negative
Let me ask you on a
impact.
different topic. The Washington Post reported 2 weeks ago that the administration was considering canceling $10,000 of federal student loan debt per borrower for individuals with incomes under $150,000. The same article stated that, quote, it was unclear whether the administration will simultaneously require interest and payments to resume at the end of August when the current pause is scheduled to lapse. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau issued a report in April of this year finding that 15 million borrowers, or 60% of all borrowers that have had their loans on pause since March 2020, may have difficulty resuming their student loan payments when a pause is over. Are you concerned about the economic impact on borrowers if we turn student loan payments on prematurely?
Well, look, this is something that the administration is weighing what the right policies are here, and we're in the middle of deliberations on it. It is a very important topic. Student debt has...
If people are called upon to pay and cannot and default, that has a real consequence, as well as in their lives, it has a real consequence to our overall economy. That's why we've been urging the President to seriously consider loan forgiveness. Finally, a study published by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth found that over 118 million homes across the United States, Black and Hispanic homeowners face an average 10 to 13% higher property tax burden when compared to similarly situated white homeowners. Would you agree that our federal SALT deduction is an important tool to reduce the effects of regressive tax policy through property tax relief?
I'm not aware of that study. I'll have a look at it, but that's something I need to look into.
But on a broader
Senator.
proposition, if I give people property tax relief and I have a disproportionate number of the universe of property tax owners who ultimately face a greater consequence of higher burdens, then I would assume that helping them with that burden gives the type of relief that inures to the benefit not only of those families, but to communities as a whole.
That certainly seems logical.
Time of the gentleman's expired. I don't know what this does to the Brown-Casey friendship, but Senator Brown is next after Senator Casey's been so patient. Senator Brown.
He's a patient man, so thank you. One quick reference to Senator Grassley's comments about corporate greed. We know that while the Secretary is not saying that it's the main driver of inflation, we know that a number of American industries, oil, pharmaceuticals, shipping companies, and others have used used the pandemic and used the war with Russia to raise prices and have seen gargantuan profits from a number of those industries, that not by accident. So we know that. Let me shift to one of our favorite topics, Madam Secretary. That is the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. The work you did, again, I compliment you every time in a public forum, what you and Commissioner Reddick did, and with Chairman Wyden's involvement, to get the IRS advanced CTC payments ready to go just 3 months after I sit on the floor next to Senator Casey. We talked about the excitement of that bill passing on March of 2021. By July, those checks were going out to 60 million, to the families of 60 million children. We should celebrate that perhaps more than we do. We know it slashed hunger rates by 1/3, cut child poverty by 40%. That's why I'm fighting alongside Chairman Wyden and Senator Bennett and others to make sure this gets extended, because it's so important for our country. Tell us in your view, some have criticized the child tax credit for all kinds of things. Would extending the child tax credit family, they'll say CTC is a primary driver of inflation. Comment on that, and then answer the question, if you would extending the expansion help families keep up with rising costs?
Well, absolutely, of course it would. You know, the aid that was provided through the child tax credit during the pandemic, as you mentioned, it reduced poverty by almost a half, and all the evidence we have suggests that the CTC reduced inequality. It increased demand somewhat. U.S. food consumption in 2021 was above the pre-pandemic level, but what that means is that families were using the additional resources that they got from the CTC to feed their children. Did it have some marginal impact on food prices? Possibly, but what's important is that fewer kids went hungry. And look, this is just not a significant factor, the child tax credit, in impacting inflation. There are a lot of things driving inflation. We've had multiple COVID variants. When we early on expected the pandemic would ease and we would get back to life as normal. We've had ongoing supply bottlenecks. There are COVID-related shutdowns all around the world, including China. On food prices, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is having dramatic impact on food prices that has utterly nothing to do with the child tax credit. It was a relatively small expenditure. It was spent out over the full year 2021, and it resulted in a dramatic reduction in childhood poverty and financial insecurity for American families, and contributed little or nothing to inflation.
Thank you. It's hard to call it anything but an unqualified success in showing that government can do the right thing and did do the right thing quickly and efficiently and effectively. Let me shift briefly in my last minute or so as Chairman of International Tax. A year ago, I teamed up with the chairman, who was Senator Warner, on an international tax framework that would put Americans first, that would get rid of incentives in the tax code that reward companies for moving overseas and ensuring that multinational companies paid their fair share. You did a very good job rallying the rest of the world around a plan that would stop this global race to the bottom and put workers first. I commend you and your very apt team on that. Why is it important for Congress to take action this year in the international tax issue? Why would American workers be worse off than if the rest of the world moved forward and the U.S. was left out?
Well, I think that this is an extremely important initiative. As one of the leading economy in the globe, and given that it's an initiative that we spearheaded, I believe we should do it. I think we need the revenues. It will raise considerable revenues. I think deficit reduction is important, but we also need revenues to spend on a wide array of programs that will, whether it's affordable housing or making health insurance more affordable, energy investments that will bring down utility bills over time. We need the revenue to support these investments and to support investments in people and making our economy more productive and lowering the burdens that households face.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Brown, and thank you particularly with Senator Warner and I leading this effort. I thank you for it. Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. I want to start, Secretary Yellen, by thanking you for your enduring commitment to public service, yet again taking on a tough job, and we're grateful for that and your presence here today and the work you've done. I want to thank the Chairman and Senator Brown as well for the work they did to make it possible for us to have the child tax credit, the enhanced version of that in place. In my home state of Pennsylvania, 2.2 million families benefited from that reduction in poverty, and that reduction occurred as much in rural areas as it did in urban areas. So we're grateful for that. I wanted to talk to you about workers and ask you one or two questions about the tax code and workers. When you compare what the tax code has done as it relates most recently to workers compared to corporations, we know in 2017 the corporate rate went way down from 35 to 21. That 14-point drop was about $1.4 trillion over 10 years. But what is not talked about a lot is what workers lost in that tax bill. They lost their ability to deduct moving expenses when a job forces them to relocate. They also lost, if they're a member of a union, they lost the deduction for the cost of their union dues. Workers can't deduct the cost of their union dues, but corporations are still permitted to deduct the cost of running anti-union campaigns. This is both an insult to American workers and should be an insult to every American, but it's also an insult and I think in direct contravention of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. Earlier this year, the President's Task Force on Worker Organizing and Empowerment spoke to these issues. I've got two bills, one bill to restore the tax deduction, but also another bill to crack down on union busting. Madam Secretary, I'd ask you to respond to this question. Do you agree that we need to restore and improve the union dues tax deduction that the 2017 tax bill took away and end the taxpayer subsidization of anti-union campaigns by corporations?
I do, and let me say that we strongly support the work that the Worker Empowerment Task Force is doing. We look forward to working with you and other members of Congress to develop legislative provisions in support of that mission.
Thanks very much. The last question I have is about the code again. In 2017, corporations had their rates cut by that 21%, as I mentioned. Business owners also got a 20% write-off on their personal taxes, but that same cut was not available to their workers. The IRS just reported by 2017 it had all but stopped auditing the taxes of wealthy private business owners. Less than 0.2% of pass-through businesses were audited in 2017. So while they were getting huge tax cuts, no one was checking to see if they were paying the taxes that they already owe. We know the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit recipients, were 5 times more likely to be audited than a pass-through business owner. Hard to comprehend that. So people making $40,000 or less, 5 times more likely to be audited. Madam Secretary, can you speak to the steps the administration has taken to make sure that wealthy business owners pay their fair share in taxes?
I mean, it's an appalling set of statistics, Senator, that you recite there. We have an enormous tax gap. Workers who receive W-2 income pay what's owed. The error rates are absolutely tiny, and most of the tax gap has to do with high-income taxpayers, including those who benefit from pass-throughs, that have opaque sources of income we know less about, and the resources of the IRS have been cut to the point where they've largely cut back on the complicated audits, the ones that are harder of high-income taxpayers. And the fact that such a large share goes to audit the EITC is very unfair. I strongly urge Congress to approve the $80 billion that we've requested for the IRS to be able to to make sure that people are paying the taxes that are due. And it's very unfair to workers and lower-income households the way things work now.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen.
Senator Casey, you and the Secretary have just given a little teach-in about this double standard in America with respect to audits, and it's time to change it because everybody ought to be held accountable, and it's got to be done in a fair way. And the point you've made and the Secretary's made is that's not being done today to the expense of people of modest means. Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing and giving me the chance to ask questions. Secretary Yellen, thank you for your service and for being here today.
Thank you.
Speaking of horrible statistics, this country is 38th out of 41 industrialized countries in the world in terms of the scale of our childhood poverty. The poorest people living in the United States are our children, and for one brief shining moment, for 6 months, thanks to your efforts and the efforts of your employees at Treasury, we expanded the child tax credit based on the bill that I wrote with Senator Brown, cut childhood poverty in this country almost in half, benefited 90% of the kids in this country, reduced hunger in the United States by 25%. It's hard to think of anything, Mr. Chairman, that we've done here in generations that has made more of a difference for working families. And tragically, we let it expire. Now, there were people on the front end of this who said, this is a terrible idea, it's going to disincentivize people from working, people are going to use the money for all kinds of illicit purposes. I can tell you, Madam Secretary, people spent the money in Colorado on their kids, and the list is long, from school supplies to lessons on instruments to back-to-school clothing. But the one thing everybody has in common, when I asked them what their experience was with the enhanced child tax credit, it is the amount of stress that it relieved from their family. Because after all, people in Colorado live in the same economy that this entire country lives in. It's an economy that for 50 years has worked really well for the top 10% of Americans, and it hasn't worked for anybody else. Washington's response over that period of time has actually been to make worse our income inequality by cutting taxes to the tune of about $8 trillion since 2001. Almost all the benefit of that went to the wealthiest people in the country. It made our deficits worse. It made our income inequality worse. It's staggering that that is what we would do. And finally, we finally did something for working people with the enhanced child tax credit and the enhanced earned income tax credit. And at the end of the year, we turned our backs on the poor children in America that benefited from this, the 90% of kids that had the benefit of this. I've been here year after year after year, Madam Secretary, at midnight on New Year's Eve or on Christmas Eve, when we didn't have any trouble extending tax cuts for the wealthiest people in this country. We didn't have any trouble extending tax cuts for the biggest corporations in America. But when we had actually lifted kids out of poverty, when all the studies that I have seen, and this is what I'm going to ask you about, Madam Secretary, all the studies that I have seen have demonstrated that the tax credit worked as it was intended and did not disincentivize anybody from working. We cut it off at a time of rising inflation. Families were getting $450 on average a month. And my understanding is that the inflation has caused about $300 a month of additional costs for families. That was more than covered by the tax credit. So in the last minute and a half, Madam Secretary, let me say, first of all, how grateful I am for your effort and for the IRS's effort and for the employees that work for you, the heroic effort that they put in place to build a system to demonstrate that we do not have to accept these rates of childhood poverty as a permanent feature of our economy or a permanent feature of our democracy. And that was thanks to the work that your folks did. So I'd love to hear your reflections as an economist and a policymaker on the effects of the expanded monthly child tax credit on children and families, and what is your sort of general reaction to all of this?
Senator, you've spoken eloquently about the benefits of the child tax credit. I completely agree with your comments. It cut childhood poverty dramatically. It enabled families to get a little bit of breathing room and to help their kids afford nutritious food and clothing and back-to-school supplies. And it really played a critical role. I think you know that the president has repeatedly said that he strongly supports extension. We would love to see Congress enact that. It's made a huge difference to inequality. It was a very important initiative. I feel very proud. I appreciate your comments. I feel very proud of the work that Treasury, and particularly the IRS, was able to do to get this money out and to do everything we possibly could to ensure that non-filers, all the many households who weren't required to file tax returns, to make sure that they receive the credit as well. I would love to see, and we've been talking about investments in the IRS. One thing that investments in the IRS would do is make sure the IRS has the modern tools it needs when we have tax credits like that to make sure they go to the families that deserve it, whether they file taxes or not.
I thank my colleague. The Secretary has got a hard stop of 12:45. I think we're in good shape to achieve that. Next in line will be Senator Warren, and I'm going to run and vote and come back, and if Senator Hassan could chair in my absence, that would be great, and I think we'll all be able to get the second vote eventually as well. Senator Warren, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being with us today, Madam Secretary. So today's hearing focuses on the Treasury Department's budget, and I want to talk for just a minute about money for the IRS. Thanks to a 1-2 punch from Republican budget cuts and lobbying from corporations and rich people who don't want to be audited, the IRS today is stuck with 1970s computers and staffing levels, unable to do its job and unable to audit wealthy tax cheats. That underfunding also causes honest, hardworking Americans a lot of grief. According to the IRS, the average American spends about 13 hours and $240 every year just to file their taxes. 13 hours, $240. And sure, some people have complicated taxes that take time. But for maybe about half of Americans, taxes could be as easy as looking at a form the IRS has already filled out, showing your W-2 and 1099 income, then using the standard deduction and common tax credits to calculate how much you owe or how big your refund will be. If you don't agree, check no, fill out your own form. If you do agree, check yes, and you are done. Easy peasy. But the IRS does not have that kind of easy peasy program. Instead, years ago, the IRS cut a deal to send taxpayers to companies like Intuit and H&R Block to figure out what they owe. And in return, these companies were supposed to make free tax filing for 70% of American taxpayers through the Free File program. Secretary Yellen, what percentage of taxpayers actually use Free File right now?
I believe that last year about 4%.
About 4%.
4.
That's right. So it was supposed to be 70%. Turns out it was 4%. And you know that is not an accident. These companies deliberately sabotaged the Free File program and steered people to products that they could charge for. Now, companies like Intuit and use misleading advertising, hid free products from Google search results, all so that taxpayers had to spend more money to figure out how much they owed. The Federal Trade Commission has now sued Intuit over its bogus advertising of free tax filing software, and last month the state attorneys general extracted a $141 million settlement from Intuit for these scams. Now, these swindles are just one reason why the GAO recently recommended that the IRS develop its own alternative to free file, stating, quote, "The IRS faces mounting risks by continuing to rely on the tax prep industry to provide free tax filing services," end quote. So, Secretary Yellen, it sounds like the free file has worked out great for corporations like Intuit, which raked in billions of dollars. But do you agree with the GAO that the current system is not working for American taxpayers and that it's time for the IRS to develop a real free file program? Or let me just ask this more directly. If we can get you the resources, will you commit to developing a free file program that actually works for American taxpayers?
So, look, I absolutely agree with the comments that you made about free file. It hasn't worked. We need to develop a new system. There's no reason in the world that a modern economy shouldn't have a system that makes it easy for such a large group of taxpayers to file their returns. Beyond that, I would also add that it's important that households be able to access the benefits that Congress often wants to provide, like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit when that was available, the economic impact payments, and for individuals who don't have to file tax returns, this can be extremely difficult.
So I'm loving everything you're saying, but I'm still listening for the part that says, if we can get you the resources, will you commit that the IRS will build its own free file program and make this available to Americans across the country?
We're certainly looking into it, but I want to make a point, which is that the IRS is under siege. It is suffering from huge underinvestment. It has massive problems that it's dealing with. Right now, our number one priority is dealing with the backlog, a huge backlog of tax returns. The IRS right now doesn't have the authority to hire the people it needs to deal with
Madam Secretary,
backlog.
Look, I'm not
And it
somebody
doesn't
who's
have the
attacking the
technology
IRS.
that it needs.
I'm trying to get you the resources that the IRS needs so it can go after wealthy tax cheats. But what I'd like to know is if we're going to fight for the resources to get them over to you, and the resources are available, will you commit to build the free file program?
It's definitely a priority. It's definitely something we should do, and when the IRS is adequately resourced, it's something that will happen.
Well, I think it's something we need to do. Look, I have a bill, the Tax Filing Simplification Act. I'm going to reintroduce it that would require you to do this. But I just want to make clear, you could do this. If we get you the money, I'd really like to see this happen.
Senator Warren.
Treasury has the authority now and needs to use it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Thune, I'm going to defer to you.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, welcome to the committee. As you know, President Biden recently wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed that tackling inflation is the, quote, top economic priority. And I think that's a welcome development for the President to acknowledge that inflation's a problem. It wasn't that long ago that President Biden and his top economic officials were claiming the extraordinary increase in Americans' cost of living was merely transitory. I know you've responded to some questions on this subject already, but do you still view inflation, which remains near a 40-year high, as transitory, or do you expect an extended period of raised inflation?
Well, when I said that inflation would be transitory, what I was not anticipating was a scenario in which we would end up contending with multiple variants of COVID that would be scrambling our economy and global supply chains, and I was not envisioning impacts on food and energy prices we've seen from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So as Chair Powell indicated himself, both of us probably could have used a better term than transitory. There's no question that we have huge inflation pressures, that inflation is really our top economic problem at this point, and that it's critical that we address it. So I do expect inflation to remain high, although I very much hope that it will be coming down now.
And the President's budget on that point projects inflation at 4.7% for 2022, which seems to be an entirely unrealistic assumption given that inflation the first half this year has been well above that rate. Has the administration's 4.7% inflation assumption proved accurate for 2022, or should that number be revised higher?
Well, we're in the process of producing a new forecast for the mid-session review. The numbers aren't locked in, but it's likely to be higher.
Well, hopefully we won't have to wait long for that, right? I mean, when does that review come out?
I'm not sure what the date is.
Let me just say, too, there's a couple things that the President obviously has suggested, that the inflationary numbers are a result of Ukraine. And clearly, if you look at the CPI inflation data, it was largely collected before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Was the President wrong to blame the pre-existing inflation on the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And do you think that it is at all attributable to the overheated economy that was accelerated by last year's $1.9 trillion partisan spending bill?
Look, when President Biden took office, the United States faced a really horrendous problem in that it was projected that unemployment would stay extremely high for many years. CBO projected unemployment in excess of 9%. And he had to decide what's an appropriate policy to address what all of us thought at that time was the greatest risk facing our country, which is that we were seeing cars line up at food banks, people going hungry, people beginning to lose the roofs over their heads, worried that they wouldn't be able to get jobs, and that we would have a generation that was scarred by high unemployment. And we put in place and designed a program in the ARP that not only was intended to address those risks, but succeeded in doing so better than anyone could have anticipated. Right now, we have about the lowest unemployment rate we've had in post-war history. In recent Federal Reserve survey, more households than ever have described their financial situation as strong. In a question about could you manage to pay an unexpected $400 expense, a record of people since that survey started said they could. So we've accomplished a lot. We have the fastest recovery of any developed country. There's no question that inflation is too high and it has to be addressed, but we're starting to do that from a situation of strength. And of course, it's important to bring inflation down.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but I would just say the economic crisis American people are feeling right now is this extraordinarily high inflation rate, which, again, to the degree that there may have been jobs created and wage increases completely eaten up. I mean, the American people are getting a de facto pay cut because of inflation, and it just doesn't seem like, and gas prices contributing largely to that. And I see no strategy out of the administration to do anything to deal with rising gas prices. And I think that there's no question that the $2 trillion bill last year overheated the economy, and it's why we have the mess that we have today. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And good afternoon, Secretary Yellen, and welcome. Inflation is the #1 economic issue I hear about from Granite Staters. Supply chain challenges and Putin's invasion of Ukraine have driven up costs across the economy, and these higher prices are straining the budgets of families and small businesses. As one way to help lower costs for families, I've led bipartisan legislation to cut taxes for homeowners who upgrade to more energy-efficient appliances. The administration has been supportive of passing clean energy tax cuts that would help lower energy costs for Americans. Do you agree that passing clean energy tax cuts, as proposed in my bipartisan bill, would help lower costs for Granite Staters?
Senator Hassan, yes, I do. I think various incentives and tax credits that would support clean energy are critical ways in which we can help lower and middle income families cut their costs, offset price pressures that they face, and address climate change, and over the medium term, reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and on global oil markets where geopolitical risks are often causing spikes in oil prices that if we were more dependent on the sun and the wind, we wouldn't face that.
Thank you. In 2020, I helped lead a successful bipartisan effort to ensure that all small businesses struggling during the pandemic had access to tax cuts through the Employee Retention Tax Credit. However, I've heard from small businesses in New Hampshire, such as Smutty Nose Brewing in Hampton, who are still waiting on Treasury to send their full Employee Retention Tax Credit payments. Madam Secretary, what is Treasury doing to clear the backlog of Employee Retention Tax Credit claims and ensure that small businesses receive this tax relief as soon as they can?
So, Senator, I'm aware of this problem, and what I can tell you is that IRS is working as diligently as it possibly can to clear what is a huge pandemic-related backlog. And, you know, things that are filed in paper, IRS is still in the process of opening these. I think a lot of these employee retention tax credit filings were paper filings that are part of this backlog. And so I think that's partly responsible for the delays. You know, I think there will not be penalties for situations that arise where additional income tax may be owed and the taxpayer is waiting for this refund payment to be able to pay taxes owed. Penalties will be waived. I know that the IRS has issued some guidance and told these filers that they may be eligible for relief. It is a very regrettable situation, and IRS is working as rapidly as they can to solve it.
Well, and I thank you for that response. I will keep encouraging IRS to work as quickly as they can, and in the long term, we all have to make sure that the IT and the systems are modernized and IRS has the staffing it needs, because obviously this is not an acceptable situation.
This is really a reflection of decades of underfunding, and it's frankly amazing that the IRS is able to do as much as they can, getting out child tax credit payments and the economic impact payments.
Yeah, I do understand that, but I will continue to push on this because I just was talking with a small business on Saturday that's really kind of on the edge here and waiting for this credit. So let me talk about one other thing, which is Russian gold reserves. Vladimir Putin has stockpiled billions of dollars in gold in an attempt to insulate the Russian economy from international sanctions. I'd like to thank Treasury for heeding calls earlier this year from a bipartisan group of senators, including myself and Senator Cornyn, to ensure that U.S. sanctions freeze Russian gold assets. Can you update us on Treasury's ongoing efforts to combat any attempts by Putin to prop up Russia's economy by selling off his gold stockpile?
Yes. This is an important matter, and we've issued guidance that gold-related transactions involving Russia may be sanctionable under the president's executive order, and we're closely monitoring any efforts that we can see to circumvent our Russia-related sanctions through the use of gold.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.